internet to a psychoanalytic cogitation. So in this series, what's going to be the main focus is more my ideas and my reflections on psychoanalysis, and not necessarily a definition or a review of a book, like it can be with a psychologist casual review for the latter and a psychoanalytic talk for the former. So here you're really going to be presented with my ideas and my reflections upon a topic. And to start off this whole series, I wanted to start with the question of happiness, which is a very interesting and very focal point of attention on so many bases. Mainly it's it's the start of many psychotherapies start with the question of unhappiness, be it because of a symptom, because of a realization, because of a state of life. Unhappiness seems to be like the crux that make people go to therapy. And yet what I find very, very, very interesting, at least in psychodynamic therapies, is that there's kind of a disdain for the idea of happiness itself, as a disdain that goes really back to Freud himself by stating that basically the whole goal of psychoanalysis was to transform neurotic misery into ordinary unhappiness. So from the get-go, happiness has never been an objective, not ever, in psychoanalysis. And it's very strange because it kind of has developed that way, even though, of course, purists will always say, no, our goal is not happiness, it's understanding, or it's meaning, or it's less suffering. But the idea is always a little there, right? Even if it's not completely explicit. And that's what I found very interesting, is that kind of strange, bittersweet contradiction within therapy itself of, yes, happiness isn't the goal per se, because that's far too ambitious. Especially because, to be completely honest, no one really knows what happiness truly is, because it varies from individual to individual. It's a very idiosyncratic, meaning very personal, deep down personal meaning to every single one of us, that one cannot generalize it. So from the get-go, we're going to have massive subjective problems on the idea of happiness. Of course, there's things that we know contribute to it, like socio-economic factors, relationships, so on and so forth. But how it's going to look precisely for every single one of us is going to be different. So from the get-go, we're already running into a problem of what is happiness and how to define it. We have a much better understanding of what is unhappiness, right? Because basically it's every state that isn't happiness or content, right? So from the get-go, from the very beginning, there's so many problems with that concept. And yet it's a concept that, even though it's never addressed as such in writings, in essays, in stuff like that, is at the crux of it. And what I've always found very, very interesting with that concept is that it's the catalyst for the hopes of the patient, because the patient comes in therapy with the hope of happiness, with the sometimes even expectation that psychotherapy will make them happy again, or happy altogether, or something virtually quasi-related to a miracle, right? Where the work is going to free them of everything. And I can't bring that, because at the end of the day, we are still permissive to the human condition. We're still going to die, we're still going to lose people, we're still going to be in suffering at certain points. And I think that there's a lot of weight to what Freud says of an ordinary unhappiness. I was going to say unordinary happiness, but that doesn't work like that. It's going to be basically ordinary unhappiness. And what does that mean? That means that basically there's always going to be suffering. In a way, it's a very Buddhist idea also, and I find that very interesting how both can parallel. That the idea is not to cut suffering, that's a complete utopia, but to help people get from one type of suffering that is psychological in essence to a suffering that's universal. And that's how I understand Freud in this context, that it's going to be go into something that's very specific, very astute and very powerful as a suffering, as a psychological suffering, something that's more common, more day-to-day suffering. And that whole idea of unhappiness being the goal is sometimes unpalatable for so many people, like, for example, for the patients, but I'm also thinking of certain other colleagues of other frameworks which basically see that as distasteful, and for some people that are more nice or more compromiseful, it seems tragic, and for others it just shows the psychoanalysis in a bad light. But I don't think psychoanalysis always brings unhappiness or common unhappiness. Quite the contrary, I think that it does bring happiness. But there is something that I think happiness has to be understood as, is something discontinuous. It's not going to be a line, right? It's going to be moments punctuated. And I think that when someone is in psychological suffering, Freud talked about neurotic misery. I'm not going to say neurotic misery because I'm going to say psychological misery, right? Because I don't think that neurotics have the monopole of suffering. I think borderlines, the whole spectrum of mental disorders suffer. But, and that's a big but, I think that every single one of them has the potential at some point or another to feel some form of happiness. And that happiness is not something that's the goal, because as a philosophy teacher of mine once told me, is that basically trying to aim for happiness is kind of the worst thing you could ever do, because in itself it's kind of too vague. Like, you have to aim for something else and then you get happiness. I mean, I don't remember exactly the arguments. He was a very big Nietzschean, I remember that, but I don't remember every single point. But I found that his arguments were at the time very interesting, that it's something else that leads us to happiness. And in this case, psychoanalysis is completely into it, because it's our relationships, it's our work, it's our creativity, it's our love, it's our care for others, it's so many things that are going to punctuate moments of happiness, pleasure, moments that we feel wholesome and complete. But it's what it is. It's moments. They're fleeting. And that's what's so, I think, fundamental to understand, is that it's not going to be happiness like a block of concrete that's unbreakable. It's going to be more like, I think, a bit like a lighthouse, moments where the light strikes and it's perfect, but other moments where it's going to be hard, it's going to be cumbersome, it's going to be anxiety-full and anxious for the person. But as long as the person knows that that light is going to shine back, I think that's the goal of therapy, is to open up hope for happiness. And of course, I think that one should try and maximize moments of happiness or moments of calm in one's life, as that's, I think, is the main goal of therapy, is to try and open up that window so that the person can benefit a maximum from it. But that being said, I understand how frustrating the idea that the happiness is only fleeting and non-linear can be. But I think that the French language has encapsulated it brilliantly, because the French word for happiness is bonheur. Bonheur is basically the juxtaposition of two words, bonne et heure, which together is good hour. And that's what it is. As in Madame de Jonquière by Denis Diderot, or is it Montaigne? I don't quite remember. But there's a character that says something that has stayed with me for a very long time, that basically it's what it is, a happy moment in a day, a happy hour in a day. And that's what I think happiness is, a happy moment in a day. But that happy moment, and that's why I'm going to bring it back to psychoanalysis and to Otto Kernberg mainly, is that those moments allow the personality to grow. Because even if they're not absolute, not complete, the fact that they have been there, or that they are there, or that they're being built, is going to be the basis of security, of being able to deal with one's life, of making better decisions, of being less anxious, not as hard, not as difficult. And of course, I think that going for happiness itself is a mirage, because I don't think happiness is a sin in itself. It's something that's brought upon good moments, and those good moments vary from person to person. And of course, one would say that, well, if we were to adopt your point of view, drugs can bring happiness. And that's why it becomes interesting. I don't think drugs bring happiness. I think that they bring a moment of euphoria, but that's not happiness, at least not in the common sense of the word. It's a moment where basically the person cuts themselves off from themselves. And I don't think that's happiness. That's something to avoid unhappiness, on the contrary. And I think that brings us to another important thing, the distinction between avoiding unhappiness and happiness itself. And I think that happiness is a state where one feels complete and whole, even for a fraction of a second, right? And unhappiness, which is basically a state of despair to the extreme and unfulfillment at the more mild side of the spectrum on this. And I think that to avoid that unhappiness, people do use shortcuts like drives, food, drugs, sex, and so on and so forth, to try and avoid that fundamental unhappiness. But that doesn't mean that they're happy while they're doing it. And I think that that's an important distinction. It's not because you're avoiding something, that you're achieving something else. And happiness, I think, can only be fleeting. But the fact that it's there, nevertheless, helps the personality. And I think that as a therapist, the whole goal is to basically help the patient open up to those fleeting moments and accept them as fleeting and not as a bedrock solid and unbreakable benchmark. It's not going to be that. It's going to be moments. But those moments are wonderful, and they're worth every single effort and every single moment to get there. At least that's my very idiosyncratic way of seeing things, both as a therapist and as a human being, that those moments are worth the fight in a way. And of course, it might differ, and given life circumstances, it might not be easy to see it my way, or even it might not even be possible to see it in the way I'm presenting it to you right now. Notably, if, for example, you're in immense suffering, physical suffering, intellectual suffering, and so on and so forth. So it's not like one general and universal truth, right? I don't want this to be any of that. This is just my cogitation, my kind of thinking that's devoid of, like, let's say, a book, an essay, a concept, right? It's just me throwing ideas at the screen and hoping to make something interesting out of it. And that's the whole premise of this conversation, is for you and me to try and make something interesting of that idea of psychoanalysis and the question of happiness. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm gonna leave it at that, as I think I've said everything I needed to say. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.